If I just handed you a handful of blueberries, a slice of fluffy white bread, and like a glass of apple juice, you'd probably categorize them automatically, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, everybody does.
Right. The berries are the healthy choice, the bread is just this neutral staple, and the juice is, a sugary treat. We tend to view sugar as this simple, uniform villain in the modern diet. Like
Hmm.
a lump of sugar is just a lump of sugar.
Right. But that packaging, the whole reputation of those foods, it creates this very comforting, but honestly very false sense of nutritional security.
Yeah,
We
exactly.
basically categorize food based on where we find it in the grocery store aisles rather than what it actually does inside our cells.
Yeah, but when you look under the hood of human metabolism, that simple categorization just completely falls apart. So, welcome to the deep dive, everybody. I'm your host, and sitting across from me is our resident metabolism expert.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here.
Today, we are pulling from an incredibly illuminating piece of source material. It's an article from bluepinehealth.com titled The Glycemic Index, Mastering Blood Sugar and Metabolic Health. And the mission for this deep dive is to really decode the hidden mechanisms that are quietly controlling your energy, your weight, and just your overall metabolic health.
It's such a crucial topic because once you see the mechanics, you can't unsee them.
Oh, totally. Okay, let's unpack this, because the central premise here genuinely bent my mind. The sugar inside those blueberries we just talked about, it behaves completely differently in your body than the sugar in that slice of white bread.
Dramatically differently.
Right. We're looking at a reality where a plain slice of toast actually triggers a more violent metabolic reaction than a literal candy bar.
I know, it sounds crazy, but understanding the mechanics of the glycemic index, or the GI, is really the crucial first step toward eating smarter. Because, that tired advice of simply eating less completely ignores the mechanical reality of how different foods interact with your biology.
It's not just calories in, calories out.
Exactly. We have to look at the speed of digestion. So the GI scale, which was actually developed back in the 1980s at the University of Toronto, is a strict numerical measurement. It runs from 0 to 100.
Just 0 to 100. Yeah.
And it measures just one thing, which is how quickly a carbohydrate-containing food raises your blood glucose levels. Pure glucose sits at the absolute top of the scale at 100.
Because it's pure energy, right?
Right. That is the fastest, most aggressive spike your body can possibly experience.
And the baseline, 0, I assume that just means there are no carbohydrates at all to trigger a response.
Exactly. So things like a plain chicken breast, a tablespoon of olive oil, or a slice of aged cheddar, those don't even move the needle on the GI scale. They're effectively 0.
Okay, so the battleground is really everything in between those two extremes. The source breaks this down into ranges, which I think is super helpful. You have your low GI foods at 55 or below, and that covers most vegetables, legumes, berries, things like that.
That was a really fibrous stuff.
Yeah. And then medium sits between 56 and 69,
All right.
capturing things like oats and brown rice. And then high GI is anything 70 and above.
Right. The danger zone.
Danger zone. That's the white bread, the white rice, and all those processed snacks. And Harvard Health actually recommends focusing heavily on that 55 or below range.
And, I mean, those ranges make logical sense on paper, but it's only when you start plugging specific everyday foods into the scale that the data completely defies expectation.
Oh, it really does.
That's when people start to rethink their entire pantry.
Yeah, because here is the absolute shocker from the Blue Pine Health data. Listen to this. White bread has a glycemic index of 73,
Solidly high.
solidly in the high category.
Yeah.
But standard table sugar-like literal sucrose has a GI of 68,
Yep.
and then a Snickers bar registers between 51 and 55.
Which is wild.
It is. That technically puts a standard candy bar in the low GI category. So based purely on this index, we should all just be swapping our morning toast for a candy bar, right, Maggie? Problem solved.
Well, I wouldn't go swapping your breakfast for a candy bar just yet.
Darn it.
I know. But the data is entirely accurate. It's just a trap if you treat the glycemic index as, like, a generalized health halo.
Like it's the only thing that matters.
Right. GI is a strict mechanical measure of glucose speed. Nothing else. A Snickers bar is loaded with fat and protein, right, from the peanuts and the nougat.
Oh, sure.
And those macronutrients actually demand complex digestion. They physically slow down the stomach's emptying process, which delays the sugar from hitting the bloodstream.
So the sugar's there, it's just taking longer to arrive.
Exactly. White bread, though, is an entirely different beast. It is almost pure pre-cooked starch. Your digestive enzymes, literally starting with the saliva in your mouth, they tear through that starch instantly.
Wow, right in the mouth.
Yeah. It is converted directly into pure glucose that just floods your bloodstream. There is zero digestive friction.
So the bread is essentially pre-digested sugar waiting to hit the blood. That makes sense. But wait, that still doesn't explain why pure table sugar is lower than bread. I mean, sugar is literally sugar.
Well, table sugar, which is sucrose, is actually a disaccharide.
Okay, science term. What does that mean?
It's a chemical compound made of two different molecules bonded together. It's 1 part glucose and 1 part fructose.
Ah, okay. Half and half.
Right. So when you consume table sugar, your digestive system has to physically split that chemical bond. The glucose half rushes straight into your bloodstream, causing that immediate spike. But the fructose half takes a completely different biological pathway.
Where does it go?
It gets routed straight to the liver for processing.
Okay, so only half of the table sugar is instantly hitting the blood glucose monitor.
Exactly. And that processing bottleneck in the liver gives sucrose a lower immediate GI score than white bread.
That feels like a technicality.
It is, because that liver-bound fructose carries severe long-term metabolic risks. Processing heavy loads of liquid fructose contributes to fatty liver disease and elevated triglycerides.
Yikes.
Yeah, so a low GI score just means the sugar is slower to hit the blood. It absolutely does not mean the food is objectively good for you.
Right, which means knowing the speed of the sugar is only half the story here.
Yeah.
If we really want the full picture of what a meal is doing, we have to account for the sheer volume of food you're consuming and how your organs are reacting to that volume.
That's the missing piece.
And the source introduces something called glycemic load, or GL, to solve this. So if GI measures the speed, GL combines that speed with the actual quantity of carbs. You multiply the food's GI by the grams of carbohydrates in your specific serving, and then divide by 100.
Yeah, and that glycemic load formula paints a much more realistic picture of the metabolic impact of your plate.
It gives you the real-world effect.
Exactly. So a low GL is 10 or below, and a high GL is 20 or above. The source actually uses watermelon to illustrate this beautifully.
Oh, the watermelon example is great.
Right, because watermelon has a moderate to high glycemic index. The simple sugars in it digest very rapidly.
But its glycemic load is incredibly low.
Yes, because a slice of watermelon is overwhelmingly just water. You are consuming a mathematically tiny amount of actual carbohydrate grams in a standard sitting.
Yeah, I think the source implies you'd have to eat a comical amount of watermelon to actually flood your system with carbs. So the way I think about it, tell me if this makes sense. GI is like the speedometer of a car, telling us how fast the sugar is hitting.
I like that.
But glycemic load is the size of the car itself. Like, a speeding motorcycle hitting a wall is one type of impact, but a speeding semi-truck hitting that same wall is a totally different catastrophe.
That is a perfect analogy.
But the source takes us one step deeper, past the speed and past the size of the load, to the insulin index. And if we stick with the car analogy, the insulin index represents the traffic cop who has to actually run out into the intersection and deal with the chaos of whatever just arrived.
Yes, the traffic cop. The insulin index measures the actual hormonal response your pancreas mounts after a meal.
Because it's not just about blood sugar.
Exactly. That's a critical distinction. Blood sugar isn't the only trigger. Protein and certain fats can actually force your pancreas to release insulin, even if they barely register on a standard blood glucose monitor.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's a direct metric of your pancreatic workload. When you consume a high GI, high GL meal, glucose floods the bloodstream within minutes. The pancreas detects this massive, dangerous surge and pumps out a massive wave of insulin to clear the road.
Right, it's an emergency response.
It is. It has to shuttle that toxic excess of glucose out of the blood and into your cells.
And what insulin actually does with all that energy once it clears the road is fascinating. The source highlights that insulin is classified as an anabolic hormone. And, when most of us hear the word anabolic, we picture elite bodybuilders and performance-enhancing substances.
Which is incredibly relevant here. Anabolic fundamentally means a state of building and storing. It's the biological opposite of catabolic, which is breaking things down.
Building versus breaking.
Right. So when blood sugar rises, insulin drives that energy into the liver, the muscle tissue, and the fat cells. But crucially, highly elevated insulin actively suppresses fat breakdown.
It traps the fat.
It chemically locks the doors on your adipose tissue. You are forced into a metabolic storage phase. It increases fat storage and prevents any existing fat from being burned for energy.
Wow. And the source actually mentions that elite bodybuilders exploit this mechanism on purpose, right?
Oh, absolutely. They use insulin off-label. They literally consider it the single most powerful anabolic substance available.
More than testosterone.
For raw mass, yeah. They use it to aggressively fuel their muscles, promote glycogen supercompensation, and just force massive amounts of muscle growth.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If insulin is the ultimate anabolic muscle builder, it begs the question of why a high GI diet of white rice, bagels, and sugary cereal doesn't just make the average person incredibly ripped. I mean, I see plenty of people eating bagels every morning who definitely do not look like competitive bodybuilders.
Well, the context of physical output changes everything. Elite competitors treat this natural hormone as a potent drug, but look at their context. These athletes endure massive physical trauma in the gym, completely depleting their glycogen stores, and they eat in a massive caloric surplus.
They're empty vessels waiting to be filled.
Exactly. Under those extreme conditions, an insulin surge forces nutrients straight into repairing and expanding that depleted muscle tissue.
But what about the guy eating a bagel in his car on the way to the office?
Right. If you are a sedentary office worker or even just someone doing a standard 45-minute jog a few times a week, your muscles simply aren't depleted. The fuel tanks are already full.
So there's nowhere for the energy to go.
Nowhere good. When you eat that morning bagel, the insulin surges, the traffic cop tries to shove the glucose into the muscle cells, but the cellular doors are closed. The muscles refuse the delivery.
Because they're full.
Exactly. So insulin is forced to route all of that excess energy directly into fat storage.
The storage phase in its absolute worst form.
Yeah, and the long-term consequences of living in that state are devastating. Chronically elevated insulin from a modern diet of high GI foods paves a direct pathway to type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and certain cancers.
The source points to a major study on that, didn't it?
Yeah, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It demonstrated that low GI, low GL diets actively lower the risk of heart disease and overall mortality. Furthermore, those low GI diets are strongly linked to higher levels of HDL, which is the protective good cholesterol.
And beyond the long-term disease risk, we also have to talk about the immediate daily misery of the blood sugar roller coaster.
Oh, it's exhausting.
It is. You eat a high GI meal, your sugar climbs rapidly, your pancreas panics and releases a flood of insulin to clear it out. But it clears it so aggressively that your blood sugar actually drops below your baseline.
The dreaded crash.
The crash. You feel lethargic, you get irritable, and most importantly, you experience this intense gnawing hunger, usually craving more quick carbs to fix the crash. It is a brutal, self-perpetuating cycle.
Spike, crash, intense hunger, repeat. That physiological loop is basically the engine driving modern weight gain.
Okay, so if we want to avoid being trapped in this insulin-driven storage phase, how do we manually put the brakes on this process? Like, how do we slow the sugar absorption down without just, starving ourselves?
Right. Well, the source suggests the ultimate tool is actually found by looking closely at the fruit aisle.
The fruit aisle. Okay, comparing different fruits illustrates this mechanical solution perfectly, right? Take dates, for example.
Yeah, dates are a perfect example. People call them nature's candy. And they are delicious, but they pack a GI ranging from 42 to 65.
That's pretty high for a fruit.
Very high. And because they are dried and highly concentrated, they carry an enormous glycemic load. Eating a handful of dates will send your blood sugar on an absolute ride.
But then you look at blueberries, and it's a totally different metabolic reality. The source says blueberries sit at a GI of roughly 25. And a standard serving only has about 6 grams of total carbohydrates.
Which makes them actually keto-friendly in moderation.
Yeah, and they're packed with polyphenols. But the real magic, the mechanism that makes berries the undisputed champions of blood sugar management, is the fiber content.
Dietary fiber is the great metabolic equalizer. It really is. It acts as a physical brake pedal on sugar absorption.
How does it actually do that, like mechanically?
Well, soluble fiber actually forms a viscous gel inside your digestive tract.
A gel.
Yeah, a literal gel. It tangles up the sugars, physically obstructing the digestive enzymes from reaching the carbohydrates. So instead of a violent flood of pure glucose hitting your bloodstream, that fiber matrix creates a slow, manageable, steady trickle.
And this perfectly explains the most frustrating part of modern food marketing, the juice illusion.
Oh, the juice illusion is wild.
It really is. The source breaks down a standard whole orange. It has a GI of about 40 and a very low glycemic load of 4 or 5. It contains 12 grams of sugar, but crucially, it comes biologically packaged with 3.1 grams of fiber, so it's firmly a low GI healthy food.
Right, but the moment you take that exact same orange and put it through a juicer, the whole metabolic profile shattered.
It ruins it.
Completely. A standard 250 milliliter glass of orange juice jumps to a GI of 66. The glycemic load triples, hitting about 15. You are instantly downing 21 grams of liquid sugar, but you're only getting 0.2 grams of fiber. Basically none. The physical brake pedal has been completely removed.
Just an incredible marketing loophole. You walk down the beverage aisle and the labels are screaming like, no sugar added, 100% natural, pure squeezed.
Yeah, and they legally get away with saying no sugar added because nobody dumped raw sucrose into the factory vat.
Right. But by stripping the physical fiber matrix out of the fruit, they've basically biohacked a piece of healthy produce into a soft drink.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
The absence of fiber transforms a slow-release natural carbohydrate into a high-speed intravenous glucose injection. Your body absorbs that 100% natural morning juice just as rapidly and with just as much panic as a commercial soda.
And millions of people drink it every morning on an empty stomach.
Thinking they are making a health-conscious choice. They are completely unaware that their pancreas is redlining to manage this sudden toxic spike in blood glucose.
So, if drinking a glass of juice or eating a piece of white bread has such a profound, verifiable metabolic impact, how on earth do we reconcile this with the mainstream dietary advice?
It's tough.
Because the guidelines we all grew up with seem completely at odds with this data.
It creates massive friction in the nutritional world. I mean, the mainstream guidelines from institutions like the USDA and the Institute of Medicine, they still strongly recommend that 45 to 65% of your daily calories come from carbohydrates.
That sounds like a lot.
It is a lot. On a standard 2,000 calorie diet, they are advising you to consume anywhere from 225 to 325 grams of carbs every single day.
And Blue Pine Health argues that volume is simply dangerous, right? Especially for a modern, highly sedentary population surrounded by high GI, ultra-processed foods.
Exactly. If you spend 8 hours sitting at a desk, deliberately flooding your system with 300 grams of fast-digesting carbohydrates is essentially a prescription for chronic metabolic dysfunction.
Wow. So what's the alternative?
Well, contrast those mainstream guidelines with the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, which is the ketogenic diet. Keto restricts daily carbohydrate intake to 50 grams or less.
That's a huge drop from 300.
Massive. And practitioners usually target 15 to 30 grams of net carbs, which you calculate by taking the total carbs and subtracting the fiber and sugar alcohols.
Dropping carbs that low essentially starves the body of its primary glucose supply, doesn't it?
It does, but intentionally. It forces a radical systemic metabolic shift. When glucose drops to near zero, your insulin levels plummet. That anabolic storage phase is switched entirely off.
The doors unlock.
Yes. Your liver is forced to begin converting stored body fat into molecules called ketone bodies. These ketones replace glucose as the primary fuel source for your brain and your muscles. You literally transition from a sugar-burning machine into a strict fat-burning machine.
So what does this all mean? Because going full keto and obsessively tracking every macro to stay under 30 grams of carbs, that sounds incredibly rigid for the average person. But eating 300 grams of carbs a day clearly sounds like a recipe for permanent sugar crashes and fat storage.
You're looking for the middle ground.
Exactly. If you're talking directly to the listener right now, how do they find the sweet spot using these practical GI tools without losing their mind?
Well, the good news is you don't have to live at the extremes to see profound metabolic benefits. You just need to apply the mechanical rules of the glycemic index to your daily habits.
Just make intelligent mechanical swaps.
Precisely. Trade the high GI white rice for cauliflower rice or intact brown rice. Swap the fluffy white bread for a dense, heavily seeded whole grain loaf. Or just bypass the bread entirely with a lettuce wrap.
And the source also stresses a golden rule. Never eat your carbohydrates naked. I love that phrasing.
It's a great rule. Tearing your foods changes the math entirely. Always combine your carbohydrates with a source of fat, protein, or fiber.
Give me an example of that.
So eating a plain apple by itself will spike your blood sugar relatively quickly, but eating that exact same apple with a handful of raw almonds changes the digestion rate.
Because of the fats.
The fat and the protein in the almonds physically slow down the stomach's processing of the apple's sugar. You are manually suppressing the glycemic load of the snack by introducing digestive friction.
That is so practical. Eat the whole fruit, skip the heavily marketed juice, and I guess ignore the giant fonts on the front of the package.
Oh, absolutely. Natural and low fat are meaningless marketing terms designed to sell products. Flip the box over, read the actual carbohydrate content, and specifically check the fiber ratio,
Right.
and lean heavily into the zero end of the scale. If you construct the foundation of your meals around non-starchy vegetables, high-quality proteins, and healthy fats, you afford yourself an enormous amount of metabolic flexibility while keeping your insulin levels low, steady, and quiet.
It's an incredibly empowering way to view your plate. We started this deep dive looking at a deeply counterintuitive reality, that a piece of standard white bread spikes your blood sugar faster than a spoonful of table sugar.
Which still blows my mind.
Same. We unpacked how insulin acts as this frantic traffic cop, forcing your body into a fat storage phase, and how dietary fiber acts as the crucial metabolic brake pedal. The ultimate message from Blue Pine Health is that understanding why your body reacts to specific foods gives you the ultimate leverage.
You're in control.
Right. You aren't blindly following a restrictive diet rulebook. You're operating the complex machinery of your own metabolism with actual mechanical insight.
Which brings us to the absolute bleeding edge of this science, because this raises an important question.
Okay, lay it on us.
Well, the source material briefly teases a concept for you to mull over. We know fiber physically slows digestion in the stomach, right?
The viscous gel.
Exactly, but it does much more than that in the lower gut. Fiber actively interacts with your unique microbiome, the trillions of specific bacteria living inside your digestive tract.
That invisible, highly personalized ecosystem.
Yes. And knowing that the microbiome feeds on fiber, we have to look at how those bacteria respond. When they consume fiber, they produce short-chain fatty acids that can actually signal the pancreas and alter local insulin sensitivity.
Wait, really?
Yeah. This raises a profound possibility. Could our highly individual gut bacteria actually dictate our personal insulin responses?
Oh, wow.
Right. Could a food that registers strictly as low GI for my body actually behave completely like a high GI food in your body, based entirely on the unique invisible bacterial ecosystem living in your gut?
That is a wild thought to chew on. So the glycemic index might not be a rigid, static number printed in a textbook at all.
It might actually be a dynamic, real-time conversation between the food you eat and your own personal microbiome.
I highly encourage you to explore that thought the next time you sit down for a meal, the next time you're standing in the kitchen, holding a piece of white toast in one hand and a handful of blueberries in the other. You know exactly what is about to happen beneath the surface. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.